When people mention secession, the image that often comes to mind is the Confederacy. People think of Montgomery, Alabama, or Richmond, Virginia, or Atlanta, Georgia. When they hear that word, hardly anyone thinks about California and Oregon. However, when the Civil War began, while most of the country looked south to the cotton field when talking of secession, other people looked west over the Rocky Mountains. President Thomas Jefferson believed in his day that there would be separate, independent Americas on the West Coast. Decades later, other people thought so too. This is a story of the Civil War on the West Coast and the nation that nearly was. This is a story of the Pacific Republic and its major role in the Pacific Theater in the Civil War. This story doesn't begin in 1861, but rather in 1846. That was when John C. Fremont and his small company of Army engineers arrived for their third expedition into Alta California. In June of 1846, totally oblivious to the war that had erupted on the Texas-Mexico border, the American soldiers started to filibuster. Fremont summoned other Anglo-American settlers in the Bay Area to join him at his camp in the Sierras. 6 days later, a band of Bear Flaggers marched into Sonoma, led by William B. Ide. 3 days later, on June 17th, in the presence of Major Fremont, the rebels raised the flag of the California Republic in Sonoma, proclaiming their new nation. There was never any civilian government, only a small insurgent army barely the size of 2 companies. William Ide acted as military governor in the few places the rebels controlled, although he didn't claim the title. He just ended up being the adult in the room. This was the first time a separate American republic had been established on the West Coast. The Anglo-American Rebellion in Mexican California lasted 3.5 weeks before the U.S. Navy arrived in July and claimed California for the United States. The Bear Flag Revolt was over, but its spirit lived on. One of the federal soldiers accompanying Fremont, who was present when the Bear Flag went up for the first time, was 21-year-old George Cross from New York. George Cross will come back later in the story of secession and rebellion. The idea of a Pacific Republic was not brand new when the Civil War started in 1861. As early as 1812, the elder statesman Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to a friend, "I considered as a great public acquisition the commencement of a settlement on that point of the western coast of America, and looked forward with gratification to a time when its descendants should have spread themselves through the whole length of that coast, covering it with free and independent Americans, unconnected with us but by ties of blood and interest, and employing like us the rights of self-government." The idea of a Pacific Republic became a movement in the 1850s as the country headed toward the sectional crisis. The idea of independence on the West Coast had been raised by lobbyists and citizens groups that leaned toward the Democrat Party, especially Lecompton Democrats. A September 1856 letter was printed in the Oregon Statesman advocating for the West Coast states and territories to form a Pacific Coast Republic. Oregon Senator Joseph Lane strongly supported the idea of a Pacific Coast Republic, and he advocated for it before the war and during the first half of the war. California's governor-turned-senator, Milton Latham, said on the floor of the U.S. Senate, "We in California would have reasons to induce us to become members neither of the Southern Confederacy nor the Northern Confederacy, and would be able to sustain for ourselves the relations of a free and independent state. We have resources not possessed by any other state in the Union, while our population comprises the most enterprising and energetic men of the country. Why should we trust to the management of others what we are abundantly able to do ourselves? Why depend on the South or the North to regulate our affairs?" California Congressman Charles Scott wrote in an 1860 newspaper editorial, "If the Union is divided and 2 separate confederacies are formed, I will strenuously advocate the secession of California and the establishment of a separate republic on the Pacific slope." Then, after years of threats, South Carolina seceded on December 20th. On January 4th, 1861, another California congressman, John Birch, wrote an open letter that was published in the San Francisco Herald. "The people of California should all be of one mind on this subject, a Pacific Republic," he said. "Raise aloft the flag of the hydra-headed cactus of the western wilds, and call upon the enlightened nations of the earth to acknowledge our independence and protect us from the wreck of a once noble union." There are no known images or illustrations of this cactus flag design, but it does tell us that there was a concept for a Pacific Republic flag floating around secessionist circles. One such flag was seen hoisted from a boat in Stockton Harbor on January 16th, ruffling plenty of Republican feathers in the Golden State. This image here is just a wild guess, based on one vague written interpretation of this flag design. Other West Coast secessionists used California's state flag, the Bear Flag, to proclaim their support for states' rights. States' rights to leave the Union and continue chattel slavery forever. One of the undersheriffs of Los Angeles, Andrew Jackson King, went parading through downtown LA with a portrait of Confederate General Beauregard in April. The Federal Army arrested him for this, and in April of 1861, King involuntarily became one of the first reconstructed rebels in the country. Then in May, the Bear Flag was raised by itself in Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and Sonoma.